All right, in this video, we're going to finish up talking about measurement. Remember last time I sort of left you on a cliffhanger between reliability and validity. I finished up reliability, which remember is the consistency of a measurement, and we hadn't gotten to validity, which is the accuracy or truthfulness of a measurement. So um, let's get into what validity is exactly. Remember, as I said, it's the accuracy or truthfulness of a test, and you might conceptualize that in a number of different ways, but a couple questions to word it in a different way. Is this test measuring what we think it is? And is this test measuring what we want it to measure? Those are overlapping in some ways, but they also have some kind of different elements to them. Remember that I started off talking about reliability and validity by mentioning how reliability is necessary for validity. You cannot have validity without reliability. And oftentimes this is useful to take a metaphor from like target shooting or whatever of precision and accuracy. Precision is reliability, that consistent measurement, and accuracy is validity. So if you are reliable and valid, you're concentrated in one area, consistent, and you're hitting the mark. You're valid, you're truthful or accurate. You can be reliable, see, be consistent, but not be accurate, kind of a little off target, but you're still consistent. Um, and you can also lack both. You can lack reliability and validity by being inconsistent and being off target. But there is no way to conceptualize being on target but inconsistent. It would mean that your measurement is only occasionally valid, which isn't being valid, right? It needs to be consistently valid in order for it to be actually accurate. So, what are some ways that we can look at validity in measurement? There are many different types of validity that we'll talk about over the course of this class, some that we won't be able to get to. I'm going to talk about four major types here that are kind of interrelated in some ways, and then we'll talk a little bit about something called internal versus external validity, which is a little bit different from measurement validity. Um, Validity and measurement, I think it's useful to show you what these different types of validity are by posing different questions and then giving some examples. Construct validity is really a very broad type of validity that subsumes the other ones. Remember, constructs are just abstract concepts that we want to measure. So construct validity is just, are we measuring what we are trying to measure? So construct validity actually includes all these other ones. Face validity, content validity, and criterion related validities are all different types of construct validity. They're all different ways to say, are we measuring what we want to? Face validity is a really not simple, but kind of a low bar test of, does it look like or seem like my measure is measuring what I want it to? A metaphor to kind of distinguish between face validity and content validity might be that you are making a pie. So if you think about the different items in a scale, like you're trying to assess agreeableness. So you want to get all the sort of ingredients for agreeableness, and you look down that list or recipe and you think, yeah, those are all the things that add up to agreeableness. The kind of same thing works for face validity. You look at the items and you say, you know, I got flour, I got salt, I got sugar, I got apples, I got baking powder, I got water, I got whatever else, cinnamon. All these things, yes, they look like they add up to an apple pie. I'm making an apple pie the same way you might say, look, I have all the ingredients that I'm measuring to know somebody's agreeableness. Content validity is not just, does it seem like I'm measuring what I'm measuring? It's, am I taking into account all the different pieces that make that construct itself? And I'm measuring all parts of the construct. So you might think about the pie metaphor here as, am I making both the crust and the filling? So if you had a pie recipe and it only said apples, brown sugar, and cinnamon, you'd say, well, you're not making a pie. You're making the filling of an apple pie, right? You're leaving out part of it. You don't have all of the content of a pie here. The same way that if you were trying to measure openness to experience and you only had items that had to do with being imaginative, Well, that doesn't cover all of the facets or all of the parts of openness to experience. So your content validity would be low because you're not taking all the pieces into account. So face validity, do I have all the things that add up to what I'm trying to measure? Content validity, do I have all of the different parts? Am I making the crust and the filling, or am I just making one or the other? The openness to experience and agreeableness examples I've been using, hopefully you're a little bit familiar with these uh, just from your day-to-day life or Gen Psych. There is a pretty dominant way of looking at personality in psychology called the Big Five aspects of personality. And they are openness to experience, conscientiousness, agreeableness, extroversion, and neuroticism, which more recently has been called emotional stability. These are by no means the only aspects of personality, but they are some very reliable parts of personality that psychologists measure. So this is what I mean, that these are big categories that contain other parts. If you want to measure openness to experience, you're not just going to measure artistic interest and tolerance for diversity, because that's not all of the parts of openness to experience. You need to measure imagination and depth of emotions and willingness to experiment and intellectual curiosity along with those other two things, or you're not really measuring openness to experience. You need all these pieces in order to have your content validity be high and properly be appropriate. Okay, the last set I'm going to talk about has a bunch of different components in it. So criterion related validities are ways that your measure relates to other things that should or should not be related to them. So criterion, let's stick with openness to experience. And the criterion might be, a behavior or outcome of interest for that might be how often do you try new restaurants, or how often do you try new types of music to listen to. If you are properly measuring openness to experience, then you would expect those things to be frequent behaviors for people that are high in openness to experience, and you'd expect people that are low in openness to engage in those behaviors less frequently. So does the measurement that you're using predict things that it should predict? So predictive behaviors, or predictive validity rather, is predicting future behavior. So you measure openness to experience and you check to see if in the future people are engaging in those types of behaviors you'd expect them to. Concurrent is slightly different from predictive. Predictive is about the future. Concurrent is about the now. Are people's current behaviors being predicted by whatever measure we're interested in here? Predictive and concurrent validity are kind of a pair here. The next two are also kind of a separate pair. Convergent validity is your measure related to things it should relate to. So for openness, it should relate to trying new things, like trying new music, making new friends, trying new restaurants. Discriminant validity is behaviors it should not be related to. So if your openness to experience measure is really highly related to something that should be irrelevant, like how clean someone's room is, or how stable their emotions are, then that might be a warning sign that maybe you're not measuring exactly what you think you are if the measure is related to things that should be irrelevant. All these things together, again, are part of criterion related validity, and trying to look at all these other outside behaviors and outcomes that might be related to the thing that you're trying to measure is something that a researcher named Paul Meehl a long time ago called your nomological net. That's not something I'm going to ever test you on. I just think it's a useful idea to think about the nomological net as all the different types of things that should and should not be interrelated about a particular construct, like openness or agreeableness or authoritarianism or whatever it happens to be. Just to give you some examples of psychological instruments, so you sort of have some other things to reflect on too in terms of measurement, kind of moving away from validity here. Just wanted to give you some examples. Need for cognition is one kind of classic psychological scale that I think is useful to mention here. I have it pulled up just so you can see some of the items. Hopefully you can see this okay. But Cassiopo, Petty, and Cow came up with this scale decades ago, but it's still used in psychology. Uh, and just so you can see some examples of types of items. Need for cognition. It's how much people, enjoy thinking, like doing puzzles or having challenging things going on intellectually for them. So I prefer complex to simple problems. Okay. If you're high in need for cognition, you might say that is extremely characteristic of me. And if you're low, you might say that's extremely uncharacteristic of me. Some of these items, though, you'll notice don't endorse things that sound like need for cognition. So thinking is not my idea of fun, or I only think as hard as I have to. Those items, having these asterisks next to them, are noting that they are reverse coded items. So on a lot of scales, you don't just want to give people things that are worded all in the same direction, because then you might have people that are just saying 5 for everything, and you think they're really high on need for cognition, but they weren't really even paying attention. They're just agreeing with everything. So this is kind of a way to make sure your measurement is psychometrically sound, as we might say, and that you are not that you're able to weed out people that are not paying attention. So that's need for cognition. Another thing we might measure, political ideology. Um, Closer to my research a little bit. This is an item that I use all the time. And it's an example of how you might want to use instructions for people. So we hear a lot about liberals and conservatives these days. I'm going to give you the scale. And you see I have a scale here with all these different points labeled with something that kind of tells people what it's getting at. It's not exact, but it gives them a way to map their ideology onto these items. Another way you might do this that might be better, instead of giving people one scale at once, you might say, hey, we hear a lot about liberals and conservatives. Do you think that you are conservative or liberal or somewhere in between? And then for all the people that say conservative, I might say, are you just a little conservative or very conservative? And same for all the liberals. And then I might ask all the people in the middle, oh, you said you're in the middle. Well, a lot of people lean one way or the other. Do you lean towards liberal or conservative? And by combining all those questions together, I can get something that's just like this scale. All the liberals are over here. The people that say they're really liberal are here. The people that say they're a little liberal are here. All the moderates are in the middle, but the people that say they lean are on either side. And it helps you get a better scale because people love to select the middle item. If you ask this question this way, you'll get lots of 4s. But if you ask the question in pieces, you'll get fewer 4s. You'll get people that will say, yeah, you're right. I do lean somewhat liberal or somewhat conservative. So another thing to think about. You might also want to think about ideology in a totally different way. Maybe it's not useful to just measure a left-right sort of idea. Maybe you want to study something about how identity matters for people. So you might say instead, how important is being a conservative to you? Or how well does the term conservative describe you? Or how often do you use we instead of they when talking about this group? And that might tell us something not just about what people believe, but how important those beliefs are to them in terms of defining themselves. So lots of different ways we might be interested in measuring this. One other one I want to mention is how sometimes it might be useful, even if it's a little problematic, to measure multiple things at once. So a lot of people that study racism, they used to, decades ago, just ask questions about what you thought of different groups. And sometimes those questions are still asked, like, do you think these groups are lazy versus hardworking or intelligent versus unintelligent, whatever? But people tend to hide their racial resentments. Maybe not as often as would be nice if they did, but people are, self-serving in when they reveal those different things. So you have to be tricky about measuring some things if people don't want to share them with you. And sometimes that means like giving them an excuse or kind of combining the things you're measuring. So racial resentment is an example of that. It's a scale that combines anti-Black affect with individualistic ideals that kind of fit with the Protestant work ethic that's popular in the United States. Like over the past few years, Blacks have gotten less than they deserve. If you really disagree with that item, you might be a racially resentful person or be higher on the scale of racial resentment, rather. It's really a matter not of some people not trying hard enough. If blacks would only try harder, they could be just as well off as whites. So if you would agree with that, then that might indicate some sort of resentment of blacks. But the way that these things are worded, they sort of give people an excuse to agree with them while still revealing something. Because there's a reading of these items that really gets into like individualism instead of racism. However, if you have a tendency to agree with all these individualist items when they're still worded in a sense that ties race into them, then we can uh, draw from that that your attitudes about blacks in particular are really tied up in this individualist idea that tends to be like a negative sort of viewpoint of that group. So anyway, I know this is not a class about ideology or stereotypes or anything like that, but I just thought giving you, after a lot of abstract talk, giving you some specific types of scales, how they're put together, excuse me, the types of wording that are involved there would be useful. One other thing I want to mention is the difference between internal and external validity. So we've talked about all these other different types of measurement validity, face and content and criterion, all these different things. But I also mentioned in the first lecture, very briefly, this distinction between internal and external validity. These are separate from measurement, but measurement contributes to them, right? So internal validity has to do with, are you actually studying what you're trying to do? Is the relationship between your IV and DV actually what you're saying? Is anything else influencing them? Are you controlling things sufficiently? So that is all internal to your study. External validity is separate from that. It is, does this happen with other researchers? Does it happen out in the real world? Does it happen in other situations? Is it generalizable? Is the question of external validity. So we have internal validity being how much control and logic do you have tightly wound within your experiment, and external validity is how generalizable it is. There, just another example here of what external validity is supposed to be. Does it generalize beyond your sample to the larger population? Does it generalize to other ways of measuring your dependent variable or even other types of dependent variables? Does it have boundary conditions? Does it go to other situations? These are things that I want to keep mentioning and keep you thinking about because they're really central concepts. And it's really important to note that these things make up the main trade-off, really, in designing studies. You can't have both. You can't have high levels of control and lots of realism and generalizability. The more control you have, the more artificial your study is going to be. So you might want to complement different studies by having what we call programmatic research that builds upon each other and utilizes different sorts of designs to sometimes maximize internal validity and sometimes maximize external validity. So you might have a really tightly controlled laboratory experiment where you're measuring the causal effects of your IV on your DV, but you realize that it doesn't really generalize to the world. And then maybe you design a field experiment where out in the real world, you're letting people, experience their natural situations and habitats, and you're measuring something about your variables of interest out in the real world, but doing it in a way that is more externally valid while sort of sacrificing that validity, internal validity. So again, just keep this in mind as kind of the key trade-off in research methods and design. All right.